from the New York Association of Towns. And thank you for raising two of the issues that we're going to now include in our discussion portion of this Muni Day. First is housing. Housing is certainly at the top of mind for many New Yorkers as well as legislators. Starting with Chris Ketzley, can each of you describe the priorities of your members in the context of the housing crisis?
Yes, thank you. Actually, it's funny, I was having some conversations here with some folks. I know a lot of folks are looking for housing right now, and my son is getting married in May, and he and his fiancee are out looking for housing, and there's a crisis on every level of housing right now. Nothing is affordable out there, but there's a few things that we focus on, and when we talk about affordable housing, I think the first thing that we need to look at is what I just brought up, is infrastructure, right? So for towns, which might be a little different than other municipalities, so many of the parts of the towns out there, many parts of the towns do not have access to water or sewer systems. So town of Glenville, for example, I just use that as a example because I'm familiar with it. Maybe half the town it has sewer and water. Those are already built out portions. Then the whole rest of the other half of the town doesn't have what it needs to invest in those infrastructure systems in order to support something like affordable housing. So this again is a critical piece to link to the fact that if we want affordable housing in the state, we have to do a lot of things. We have to bring down the cost of housing, but we also have to invest in infrastructure from the state so that towns in particular have the investments they need to support affordable housing and new housing. Do you want me to pass it one way or the other?
Yeah, Steve, please. Where are county leaders on the housing crisis?
Thank you, Mark. Like Chris, the counties of New York appreciate the governor's attention on housing. Seems to be something the governor is very interested in addressing. And local governments look forward to partnering with our governor and our state legislature to try to get some reform through the process. For counties, again, similar to towns, infrastructure is our big connection. We don't have the zoning ability, zoning ordinances, zoning laws to address housing, public housing, other regulatory issues. That is a function of the towns, cities, and villages. But we do have drinking water, and we do run drinking water systems, and most often wastewater. So we need to have, as Chris mentioned, a dedicated funding stream to address both drinking water and wastewater treatment connections, bringing those connections to the quote-unquote last mile for that developer to put in the housing that's so necessary around this state. Working with our seniors over the years, it's been a priority of the state to keep folks in their houses as we get older. Well, that limits the supply of housing, and that causes a problem all around the state. Good for our older adults, but not as affordable for our younger ones that want to stay here. So we'll continue to partner with our governor. Broadband, very important for us all, each of us, trying to either bring that what's called last mile, work with the state on all these programs. Federal government has put a high priority on broadband, Connect All, the various state programs that we have and the federal programs that have been in existence. We need to remind our new president that these programs are important to Americans and to New Yorkers. EV charging stations, new statutes in place now for new housing projects have to have mandatory number of EV charging stations. So those are the types of issues. Lastly, road access, bringing roads to these new housing facilities, and what's become more and more important, and it's part of the governor's budget, is electricity and bringing in electricity. The governor talking about the FAST Act, or having transformers stockpiled to help bring power to housing developments, and that's something we very much support. and we encourage the legislature to enact. A recent example being in the town of Henrietta in Monroe County, which this was a game changer for that town for a very large-scale housing project. So I'll stop there. Lastly, one final thing, Mark, and that was the private equity owns, in our estimation, about 20% of the housing stock. So we do support the governor's proposal to put a moratorium or a pause on private equity funds purchasing houses before they go out to the public.
Thank you, Steve. Over to you, Barb. What is NICOM's position, and what are you saying on housing right now?
So I don't want to be repetitive because I agree with most of what you both said. Our members clearly recognize housing as a major issue, whether it's the affordability, the quality of housing, or the lack thereof. This is something we talk about at every conference we have. We have panel discussions with either the experts from the state level or our members who have figured out ways to do really good things on the housing front. And so we want to try to replicate those things in other communities. As you may know, we were not big fans of the housing compact. We didn't like that at all. And I think when we were pushing back so hard, it was not that we didn't think we needed housing, not that we didn't recognize that housing was a crisis, but we didn't like the top-down approach, the one-size-fits-all, the arbitrary percentages. So that was something we did push back against, but we asked the governor, we said, give us incentives. Help us do what's right for our communities, because it's our local officials who know what's best for their communities. And that's exactly what I think she did when she established the Pro Housing Communities program, which we do think is working. And I was happy to see in the executive budget that she has proposed giving technical assistance to our members to try to get them certified as Pro Housing Communities, because while a number have made it through that process, there are some out there that need some help. And so we think she has now taken the right approach, and we thank her and we thank the state legislature for taking a different tact. The issues we hear about most still are, obviously resources for infrastructure, but also resources for acquiring property and developing property. The speed at which the state allows for affordable housing, the approval processes that communities need to go through is very, very slow. It takes years to get these projects completed sometimes, so that is something we've heard from our mayors. The fact that some of these programs require local matches, particularly the HUD programs, they require a local match, which sometimes is an obstacle for our communities. And we've been arguing with that we need more incentives for developers. They're balking at some of these opportunities just because they don't think it's worth it. So those incentives need to be available for developers to invest in our communities and invest in housing. We also need to strengthen the housing tax credit programs. And a number of these things I'm talking about are actually some of the proposals that we have seen in the governor's executive budget. So we're happy to see that. Excuse me. And last thing I will say is we need to strike a balance. It's not all about affordable housing, but also middle income housing. And so we have to, if we box our developers in, they're going to walk away from these projects. So we need to be able to strike that balance. I'm sorry. Like I said, we have a lot of communities out there who have done some really great things. We're going to try to get those ideas out there, mimic those ideas. We put them in our magazine when we can, and we try to get those communities out there and get those programs replicated. Last thing I'll say, I think the short-term rental bill is going to help. The bill that was passed and signed just this year, just a couple of weeks ago, I think that's going to make a big difference, because a lot of our communities, I'm looking over at my president, she has a real issue with short-term rentals. She's got Colgate University in her village, and the alumni, the parents, they're buying up all the property and using them as short-term rentals. So I think that that legislation, that new law is going to make a big difference going forward.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Steve. Stay with us. We have other issues that we're going to talk about, but first I want to recognize Senator Helming, who joined us, and also one of today's sponsors of the Muni Day, Senator Martinez. And I'd like to ask Senator Martinez to come to the dais to say a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, welcome. I heard this has been a successful event, Municipal Day. It's very important that we understand what we do. For those of you who do not know who I am, I chair local government in the New York State Senate. Monica Martinez representing the 4th Senatorial District, which is Long Island, Suffolk County specifically. But I am honored to be here. One, as a chair of local government, one of the things that we really try to focus on is the needs of our local municipalities. You're the ones that know exactly what is happening, boots on the ground. You know what the needs are. You know what your constituents needs are, which then translate to bills that are within the committee and then actions to be taken. We had over 700 bills go through local government last year. We did have a successful, I mean, not all 700 went through, right? But we had a nice amount of bills that were not only passed, but also signed into law, helping our local municipalities. You know, it's budget season. One of the things that we try to work at is try to get more money for our local towns and villages and county. Last year, we were able to secure additional money in AIM funding, which had not been done in decades. So that was a definite plus. We're going to continue doing that this year. And aside from that, I see that my partner on the assembly side is here, and I look forward to working with you. Obviously, you know that I had a great partnership with Assemblyman Thiel since we were both on the island, but I do look forward to working with you and doing great things for our local governments. But again, I am here as a conduit for you. Anything that you need within your local municipalities, please let me know. Hi, I just realized. And however I can be assistance, please know that I am here. But again, thank you for being here, and congratulations on this great event that you had this last 2 days, and you're always welcome here. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes, thank you.
Back to the discussion panel. We have all read news stories of the staffing and funding crises impacting our emergency medical services. Starting with Barb, can you describe how your association and your members are helping to address this crisis? What role do local governments represent by these 3 associations play in aiding our EMS providers?
So I get to go first on the toughest question of the day, I would argue, because this is clearly a crisis, and I don't think anyone has any easy answers right now. Thank you so much, Wade. This is another one. This is a issue we have a session on at every single conference, because again, we're just looking for ways, how do we address this crisis that we're all facing? So we do have some communities that are out there and are trying to figure out ways to do this and do this well. And so once again, we feature them. We have discussions. We have roundtables. And this is going to be something I think we're going to end up working a lot on together this coming session. We have a policy committee. So we have 4 policy committees at NICOM. And the policy committee on labor relations and public safety has absolutely made this priority. We're forming a subcommittee at the executive committee level to, again, see what we can do to come up with solutions. I don't think it's any secret. I mean, there are some key issues here. Staffing, you know, we have to try to make this profession feel valued and feel respected. And with that, you have to pay them well. You have to give them what they need. You got to provide them with the benefits they need. But I think another big issue that I think has come up more recently in the last few years, there are mental health issues associated with this profession. There's burnout, and those are things, you know, we talk about mental health a lot, and it cuts across so many sectors of what we do, but in the EMS, I think it is a particularly important issue that we cannot lose sight of, because you hear there's been surveys done, people are in this job for 2, 3, 4 years, and then they're out. And I think a lot of that does have to do with the mental health pressures that they face when they have to respond to some of these traumatic events. You know, there's another issue that I think funding is obviously an issue, and we have been big supporters of the EMS Essential Services Bill that I know the governor put in her executive budget again this year. So we want to see this, you know, designated as an essential service. We want there to be funding streams dedicated to it. But there's also some data issues that I think the controller pointed out when he put his report out last year. There's not enough data out there to help us make the right decisions on how best to provide this service. There's gaps in service that we don't know about. There's mutual aid that we don't really understand how it works. We don't know enough about response times. And I think once we get that data all together, we can make better decisions on how best to coordinate this. NICOM members are not always wild, I'll be honest, about county takeovers of service. We have pushback sometimes when the state has made suggestions that the county come in and take over various services that our cities and villages currently provide. This, though, is one area where I think we would be open to discussing that, because I think there absolutely needs to be regional coordination in this instance.
Thank you, Barb. Chris, where's the Association of Towns on the EMS crisis?
Yeah, we're going to do our best not to just mimic each other and just repeat what everyone else has just said, but you'll see there's general agreement on a lot of these issues. So, I'm just going to echo real briefly that, ambulance service needs to be declared an essential service. We have a crisis, there's no question about it. When I was supervisor in my town, we dealt with this crisis all the time. There's a couple key components to it, and Barb hit on a few of those. We have a decline in volunteerism, generally speaking, in the fire departments in particular and other areas. Lack of public funding. If we're going to declare an essential service, there needs to be an investment from the state into this service, because when you look at a local government trying to provide something this expensive and this critical, it's very difficult. And I'm going to go right back to that tax cap formula, because if a local government is going to have to take on a new service like this, it's going to shatter the tax cap. We have to acknowledge this. I know there's a lot of pushback that nobody wants to talk about the tax cap, but I'm going to tell you right now, NIOT is going to talk about the tax cap often, repeatedly, and talk about how unfair it is to the towns to have this formula in place. There needs to be pushback. We need to look at that. If we're going to define this as a service that a town has to offer, which I also agree with Barb, really is more of a county or regional service because it is so large, there needs to be some address of the tax cap in order to do that. And there also needs to be dedicated funding. I'm not going to get into the issue of Medicaid because my good friend over here, I think, has some things to say about Medicaid reimbursement. But I know when we worked with the fire departments, we worked with the local public or the private ambulance services, Medicaid reimbursement is a major issue for providing these services to our residents. And we need to address that if we're going to move forward with finding answers to a crisis that is affecting our communities.
Steve, do you want to take this one? Emergency medical services.
Yes, thanks, Mark. I'd also like to acknowledge what Barb mentioned about short-term rentals and housing. And I did want to thank Ryan Gregoire and the staff of the other two associations for working so hard. More importantly, the members of the legislature and the governor for signing that piece of legislation. That's a transformative piece of legislation in housing. It affects every county of this state, and it is going to be a big deal. So appreciate the work of the state legislature and Barb for mentioning short-term rental related to housing. Look, on EMS, we had a great year with the state legislature last year. Outstanding leadership by Assemblymember Jones in particular, and what he's done with his legislation and his support, laser-like focus. Assemblymember Simpson, his support, the needs that he understands in the North Country. Both of those gentlemen are from the North Country. They know how hard it is. You can't have a 20-minute wait time. It's unacceptable. So we did some great things last year on EMS reform, providing public health care, or providing health care on scene instead of an unnecessary visit to an ER. We enabled EMS to bring people to an urgent care facility. How common sense was that? But that was a difficult piece of legislation to get through, especially with the health department regulations. So really, congratulations to the state lawmakers for working together with local governments. Look, it can't be a mandate. The governor has some language out right now in the budget. Very appreciative of the governor advancing that language. Very appreciative of Assemblymember Jones for his legislation, but it just can't be a mandate. When we see that word shall provide, that's a problem. We have to have local flexibility, and we'll figure it out amongst the counties, towns, cities, and villages. But having a county take over an EMS situation is not a good idea unless they work it out with the towns, cities, and villages. There shouldn't be any shifting around at the local level without flexibility and the ability to work together to get that done, and it should never be mandated by the state. Chris mentioned Medicaid. Half the population's on Medicaid, 10 million people in New York State. Yet we provide one of the lowest reimbursements for EMS transport. We have to do a better job. We need to put 40 million towards increasing that so we can get to at least half of the Medicare rate, which is provided in our bordering states. So thanks for bringing that up, Chris. We need to focus on that, and that's my contribution, Mark, on EMS.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a tough nut to solve, but we will, working with all of you in this room. Thank you. Next, we are going to talk about infrastructure and economic development. We combine these two topics because they intersect with one another. They are interdependent. Our communities need a strong infrastructure to provide opportunities for businesses to grow and support industry. Couple of questions in here. How do you think state lawmakers should go about addressing these connected issues? And how can counties, cities, villages, and towns be helpful in developing a strong support system for our infrastructure and our general economy? Let's start with Stephen Aquario on this one. Steve, where are the counties when it comes to infrastructure and economic development?
Well, it's very important for counties. We have to foster job creation, job retention. Micron in central New York affects the whole state. We have to work with our SUNY Chancellor, John King, on engaging our SUNY systems and our community colleges locally to provide economic development, jobs, keep people here. For NISAC, our priority is going to be the renewal of the county infrastructure program that was advanced by our governor and approved by our state legislature for $50 million. We need that renewed, extended for another round in this fiscal year. So the infrastructure, the county infrastructure plus up, very important. That's tied to housing and that's tied to economic development, or we don't get the grant. So fantastic program. We need to focus on that because we're sending so much money to Albany, $14 billion. It's really critical that we have that type of a program to focus on infrastructure and economic development. Chris mentioned the SWAP Act. Counties support the SWAP Act too. It's a dedicated funding stream. It was designed after the CHIPS formula for water, drinking water providers, and we strongly support that for our infrastructure. Our CHIPS program is the lifeblood of our local road system. We have about 85% of the road miles in New York State at the county, town, city, and village level, and we strongly urge the continuation and increase of our CHIPS funding. And again, our water infrastructure funding is very important to us, but also to take a look at our rural areas of the state with water districts. And if you got a town of the size of 20 or 50, as Chris mentioned, 500, very difficult for that town to run a water district with just receiving a grant and just the residents or the people who live in that very tiny water district to provide drinking water. So those are the types of programs that we're going to be focusing on this year.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And to Chris Ketzley of the New York Association of Towns.
Thank you. This is an important topic for all local governments, but particularly towns. I think, again, Steve touched on the important ones. Infrastructure, right? We want to drive economic development. We need to make investments in infrastructure. We're going to talk about the SWAP Act again. Obviously, we need that dedicated funding source. If we take nothing else from this today, understand that we need that dedicated funding source in order to support all functions within local governments. I say all the time, when we invest in infrastructure, when the state invests in infrastructure and they put it into towns and cities and counties, they're investing not just in those towns and those communities, they're investing in the state of New York. We are part of the larger infrastructure system, and so those investments are investments in the state of New York, not just in local government. I want to touch on two very important issues, though, that come kind of tangentially around this. Number one, home rule, right? Towns are exclusively responsible for land use and planning. Whatever we do at the state level, we have to respect home rule. There are some communities that want to invest in economic development. There are some communities that do not. We need to respect the people where they live. It's all about them. I used to tell developers all the time, you come into this town, you develop something in this town, and then you go away, right? We are the people that have to live with whatever you leave behind. And those impacts are important. So let's leave planning and zoning to towns intact and preserve home rule in whatever we do. And the last thing I want to just point out on this is the IDAs, right? We support the fact that IDAs need to be at a county level and they need to be able to negotiate as a one unit, and that we should not have people at the table from all the different municipalities because it gets diluted a little bit. We understand this, except there's one issue that we have to talk about. When the IDA, the county IDA, sits down and negotiates away the town's levy in a pilot, that's not right. That's not right. I want you all to think about if you were to go somewhere and someone was able to say, you know what, I'm going to give you Barb's money. She has nothing to say about it, but I'm going to give you her money in order to make this deal work. That's not right. Particularly because I hear from legislators all the time, well, think about all the great economic benefits that come from this, right? Well, yeah, but not to the town. Towns don't get sales tax by right. They may be able to work with counties in order to share some, if by the grace of the county. We don't get hotel and occupancy tax. We don't get any of this stuff. But we lose the levy. The only thing the town has is the levy. So let's go back and make this full circle. We have a tax cap we have in place, right? And then the IDA takes pieces of the growth of the levy away. That hurts our tax cap. And oh, by the way, for some reason I can't explain, pilots are exempt from the tax cap. That growth is exempt from the tax cap. So that puts towns in a very, very difficult position in order to provide those critical services we talked about when we're giving away the only funding source they have. And I want to just bring that out because that's an important issue that we're going to be bringing up this legislative session.
And Barb with the New York Conference of Mayors.
So I know we keep saying we're trying not to be repetitive, but I have to be repetitive on this issue. Two things I want to be repetitive on. The SWAP program. You heard it from Steve, you heard it from Chris, now you have to hear it from me. This is something that obviously NICOM has been advocating for many, many years. Senator Hinchy has carried the bill for us for the last couple of years. And there's just a few things I want to point out about this. Not just that we need this dedicated funding stream, but this would help us with the upkeep, with the maintenance, so we don't have to wait until we have an emergency and then try to apply for the grants through the CWIA program, which very many of our municipalities cannot get their hands on. This is hopefully going to help us avoid having to go to the grant programs. And we're not saying do away with the grant programs. I want to make that clear. There's a lot of money that has been dedicated to the CWIA that has not yet gone out the door. So we're saying keep the money that has gone out the door dedicated to the grant programs, but that money that is slowly not getting out the door, I should say, that money can go to fund the SWAP program, and I do think it'll make a difference. So we're not saying do away with one to support the other. We're saying maintain the grants, but also give us the SWAP program. The other thing I do want to be a little repetitive on is I know Chris has brought this up a couple times, is the tax cap. There are certain things about the way your tax cap is calculated under the current formula that are actually a disincentive to economic development. One is the way pilots are treated, which Chris has already mentioned. There's also the fact that business improvement districts, the levies associated with those bids, are included in the tax cap calculation, which we think is a huge disincentive. People are no longer forming bids because they know that's going to hurt them in terms of their tax cap calculation. And then obviously the capital expenditures that we have to account for, unlike the school district. So I will say that there is we recognize that the tax cap is not going away, but we do think that there is some tinkering that can be done that would make it better for everyone, particularly as it relates to economic development. the other thing I just wanted to mention was there was an article in the paper just this weekend about the cost of building in New York State and the cost of construction, saying that New York State is one of the most expensive states in the nation. And unless we are willing to address things like labor costs, like prevailing wage, like the scaffold law, that is not going to change. And that's what is making businesses walk away, and that's what's hurting our economic development. And I think it's very important that, I know some of those are third rail issues, but the only way we are gonna be able to address this is by dealing with some of those obstacles that are keeping people out of New York.
Thank you. Staying with Barb, we can't talk about economic development without infrastructure, as you've just heard from these executive directors. We also can't talk about economic development without talking about workforce development. We need a strong workforce to fill employment opportunities, both within government and in the private sector. How should state lawmakers address workforce challenges, and how are local governments tackling these issues within their own workforce and working alongside their private sector partners? Barb.
So this is another one of those issues where I really think we're all going to be coming together on even more in the upcoming session, because we all have talked about workforce issues, because it is an epidemic, and it's an epidemic not just across all the classes of local governments here in New York, but across the country. And one thing that I think makes us unique is that the provision of local government services, when you think about it, the things that our members do day in and day out to provide essential services, those things cannot be automated in a lot of instances. They also cannot be done remotely. And that's what's attracting younger generation in particular to the workforce, those hybrid models, those abilities to work from home. And we cannot offer a lot of that when it comes to local government. So I think that is an obstacle we're going to really have to overcome. Obviously, we need flexibility in hiring. You're going to hear us talk about, it's in our legislative program. I believe it's in the Association of Towns as well, the need to reform the civil service law. It's archaic. It doesn't work. There needs to be some tinkering done to civil service. We would love to see the threshold of what public sector retirees can earn increased, so that we can recruit some of those folks. They have the expertise. We would love to be able to bring them back to our communities to help us without having to pay for expensive fringe benefits, but also being able to tap into their knowledge. We need flexibility when it comes to residency requirements. We don't want to be forced to go to the legislature every time we want to hire someone from outside of our county to work for one of our local governments. So these are things I think state lawmakers can do to help us. But we also need to make our local governments one of those best places to work. And that's what we have to think about a little bit outside the box of how we can do that. We have to draw people to the public service motivation. There are a lot of people out there who want to do good things for their communities. And that's what we're going to have to market our local associations to do, to help our members with campaigns to attract people to local government. The city of Syracuse has a campaign right now to recruit people. The city of Albany has been working on a campaign for the last several years to generate interest and help people understand what local governments do and how people can give back to their communities. So those are the things we are really focusing on at NICOM.
I absolutely agree. This is a crisis for towns. This is one of the biggest crises I think towns are facing. I brought this up a couple of times. First and foremost, we have to look at what happened the past year or two in the job market, right? Wage inflation, call it wageflation. It has gone through the roof, and private sector, they're able to keep up with that. They're in fact the ones driving it. We see minimum wage going up by each and every year, and we're going to get tied to inflation they're talking about. So all of these pressures on town governments aren't able to keep up with the wages the private sector is able to pay. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, where do we get our resources from? The levy. So going to the levy, if we want to even try to bring our wages up to compete with the private sector, we're going to shatter the tax cap. So here we go back to the tax cap and talking about how we need to make some changes there to make it fair and equitable. I have had some towns tell me, Chris, we're willing to look at trying to get more competitive, but it will shatter the tax cap. We have to look at that. We have to talk about that. But now towns are, and I'm just speaking for towns, are a little less competitive because we don't have the pay scale the private sector has. We need to look at tier 6 again. And this seems counterintuitive for people, for us to say, let's look at tier 6, but we're not competitive anymore in the retirement system as we used to be with the private sector. So we have to look at tier 6 and see what can we do to make it more attractive and make that competitive advantage that we do have over the private sector back again. But Barb touched on a couple of things that I think the state legislature can really look at. Number one is provide funding for training. Invest in the workforce in this state. The governor said in her State of the State, and I absolutely applaud her for it and I support her on it, that we need to make investments in our workforce. And we need to make investments in critical industries. Well, I'm here to tell you one thing. There's no more critical industry in this state than local government. We are the backbone of the services that are provided to each and every one of the residents across this state. Our towns represent 9.1 million people in this state. We are the critical industry that needs investments in workforce development. Give towns the ability to train their people. CDLs is a perfect example. We've heard from the highway superintendents over and over and over again. It's expensive, it's difficult, it's hard to get people to get their CDLs. And when they do get their CDLs, guess where they go? They go to the private sector and make a lot more money. If we have an initiative here that if the state can help with funding those CDLs and those people work for either state, local, or county government, then let's pay for that. Let's make investments in training our people. Let's create a scholarship program so that our town officials can be trained. And then the second thing that Barb talked about that we're also doing at the association, and it'd be great if the state could help fund, is a public awareness campaign. I remember, okay, I'm an old person here, I can tell you, I got the gray beard and all. I remember the day when you wanted to work for a town government, you had to know somebody. You had to try to get into a town, you begged to get into a town government. Today, nobody knows what a town government even does. They don't know what's available in the town government. So as Barb talked about, if we can put a marketing campaign around recruitment, around understanding about the career opportunities you have. And when you think about a town, we have career opportunities, everything from the professions of comptroller, finances, receivers, assessors, things like that, to the trades. The trades are huge for a lot of our departments. Police officers. I won't even get into how difficult it is to get a police officer today. There used to be a time when on the civil service list you had 300 in a county on a civil service list. Today you have 30, and you're competing with much larger organizations on that. So, those are just some of the ideas that we think would be important. And I do want to put a plug in for amending civil service. It's old, it's outdated, it's not working. I'll tell you just a quick anecdote. When I was supervisor, we used to put out an application, call for resumes. Then we would get them, but we'd have to go to the list. If the list wasn't available, then we had to wait for a list to be available. Then we had to wait for the test to be scored. Meantime, guess what that person was doing? They weren't waiting on us. They got jobs in the private sector within a day. It takes me months to hire somebody. And, you think about some of the reforms to the civil service program. Number one, if you are licensed by the state of New York, why are we making you take a civil service test? The state of New York has already said you're qualified for the job. We need to exempt our professional class from civil service testing because they are already qualified through licensing. And if civil service does not provide a test within 9 months, then we suggest that the law ought to state that those people move from probation to permanent based on qualifications of already going through the probationary period. We cannot wait on tests to be created for people who are waiting for their permanent job. That's not fair to the employer, and it sure is not fair to the employee sitting there waiting sometimes a year or two before they know if they even have it, if they can keep their job. And the last thing I just want to point is the salary cap on retirees. We need to raise the salary cap on retirees. We have a lot of great people leaving. They're leaving early. We can use their professionalism. We can use their experience. They're willing to come back, but we haven't addressed that cap in a long time. We need to address that cap and make it affordable for people who want to come back and provide services to local governments. Is it going this way?
We'll go this way to Steve Aquario from the New York State Association of Counties. Before you begin, Steve, we want to recognize Assemblywoman Griffin. Thank you for joining us. Assemblyman Smolin, thank you for joining us. And Senator Tedisco, we appreciate you being here. Stephen, on workforce development.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Look, it's real hard for all of us right now in the state. I'm sure in New York City and rest of state, very difficult to fill positions, child welfare positions, public health, environmental engineers, water superintendents, people working in the water department, sewer department, as Chris mentioned. Very difficult to recruit in corrections, staffing our jails and police, DPW workers, CDL shortages, and on and on and on. It's a problem. We need to partner with our state. Our state needs to be creative in its solutions. Thank you, Senator. Our state needs to be creative in its solutions to address this, and we look forward to working with them on that. I think the idea of if an individual has a license, why are we going through competitive examination again? It's redundant, it's not necessary, and other states probably don't do that. I know in South Dakota, if you have a license from any other state, you're welcome to go to that state and work there with that license. Governor advanced community college reform here, providing education for 25-year-olds and over with certain trades and certain jobs to pay for tuition for those individuals. We're going to be looking into that proposal. The New York Helps program has been a big help for us, and I know Alex is here from the state CSEA and local CSEA, and we appreciate the union support with the New York Helps program. Perhaps we need to continue that, expand some of those titles. I know in corrections we're trying to get some additional titles in the New York Helps. But that program, Mark, has been a huge benefit in getting people in the chairs. So thank you to the union, to CSEA, for championing that and helping us get that through. We need to remove, in certain areas, college education for certain titles and going through what needs a college education, what doesn't, so that people can come in and work. Last thing I'll mention, two other things. Residency continues to be a problem for us. Just the other day, Patrick and I from the office are trying to help a county with an assistant district attorney in a neighboring county. Does that individual need to reside in the county or not? And it's a very rural county, and there's not a lot of lawyers up there. So the state has made efforts with residency, and I think we can do more and should do more, because that's a local home rule option. As Chris mentioned, home rule being very important to all of us up here, so allowing us some home rule requests in residency would be very important. Lastly, I'll just end with this, Mark, and by the way, great job for hosting us, is on recruitment issues for our volunteers. And I think Barb mentioned that in one of her responses. We need to do a better job for expanding benefits for volunteers in our volunteer fire. So that is a workforce challenge for us. How do we continue to expand those benefits for our volunteer EMS, volunteer fire? And so we'll be working with our partners here at the table here and our lawmakers on how to do some expansions in those benefits. But it's been a pleasure to be here, Mark. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Steve. That's Stephen Aquario from the New York State Association of Counties. Chris Ketzley from the New York Association of Towns.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. And Barb Van Epps from the New York Conference of Mayors and Municipal Officials. Thank you very much for being here for this panel. Now, as you've seen in the last half hour or so, the executive directors work very closely on behalf of all local governments across the state of New York, and so do our staffs. So if you're a staff member of NIAT or NISAC or NICOM, please raise your hand. Thank you very much for the work that you do day in and day out. And for attendees, again, I want to thank all that have attended. Thank you for sponsoring Assemblyman Jones. And please take this opportunity to interact with our staff members on policy priorities that you in your office may have and that would be helpful for local governments across the state of New York. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.